Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 337 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on what is passive aggression, and it is Saturday, 26th of July 2025 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is a lot of fun and it's really interesting because at some point in our lives we will always meet someone who is passively aggressive, whether it's a family member, a friend or a colleague at work. Someone will always have an issue with you at some point, whether you've done something wrong or, to be honest, it's just a perceived issue and you haven't done anything wrong, but for some reason you've angered this person and they are not comfortable enough to express their anger, hostility and frustration at you directly, so they decide to be passively aggressive about it. But as aspiring or qualified psychologists, we can actually take this to another level, because what if our clients, what if the mental health services we work in, what if they're being passively aggressive, and what could this mean for therapeutic success? And that therapeutic aligns with our client, which, as we know from lots of research, is the one major critical factor that determines therapeutic success. So there's lots of food for thought in today's episode. So by the end of it, you're going to know what is a passive aggression, what are some examples of a passive aggression, and most importantly, how to deal with a passively aggressive person. So what to say, what not to say, and lots more fascinating insights. So you've got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we've written from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and the first one is, what makes a successful transition to a school? Do you remember what it was like to start school? Intimidating new places, being unsure of the schedule, lots of new potential friends, and maybe a few foes. It's a huge moment for kids and their families that brings with it a lot of complex psychological challenges. In the new episode of our podcast Psych Crunch, our very own John Sutton chats with Professor Claire Hughes about the hurdles families face when their children start to school and what it means to be school ready and more. So I won't actually talk about what the podcast episode dives into because I've not actually listened to it, but sometimes I think I really should start listening to the Psych Crunch podcast because it is meant to be really good. But I listen to so many podcasts and I struggle to keep up with all of that as it is. But I am going to take the spirit of the article because as a student ambassador, I see this like quite a bit. So even though I work with 12-year-olds up until 18 years old and some adults, you can still see the students that have actually taken really well to school, but also they really haven't. For example, like some students, even though they're in a secondary school, so I don't know what the American equivalent is, but so like a year 7 is the start of our secondary school. So maybe high school is a good equivalent, and you can see though that some of these are very shy, they're very nervous, they're very unsure because up until last year they were the oldest in their school. They've been living and studying with their friends after like 6 years. Those friendship groups might have been broken up because they went to different secondary schools. Also, they're now the youngest in the school, and there are people who are a lot taller, than them, and there is a massive jump between primary school and secondary school, because in secondary school you've got to manage your own timetable, you've got to go to different rooms after lessons, so there's a massive jump. And from what I've seen, there tends to be a few different things which makes someone navigate that transition quite well. So if you're more social, then I definitely think that that helps. If you're able to find your crowd, and this is not necessarily the popular kids, this could be the nerdy groups, the neurodivergent outcasts, and unfortunately, I do have to use that word outcasts because in secondary school, me and my neurodivergent friends, and same for what my housemates have said over the years, it very much is a case of neurodivergent and queer and LGBT plus people are very much on the fringes of the social groups at a secondary school. So it's just something to bear in mind. But I would say that the biggest tip is if you've got that family support, support though that teaches children kindness and confidence, being confident in who they are, just so they're able to talk to people and that they're able to find their crowd, whether it's chess people, board games, Warhammer, Dungeons and Dragons, and so many other little facets of society and our shared interests, then that can be really helpful. And then there are some stuff that schools do which I really like. For example, in one school who I worked with, and this is something that I did twice a week for 7 months, was a breakfast club. So a breakfast club was a really good opportunity for year 7 students who struggle to make friends, had to come out together, have some breakfast, and just talk and play games with other students. And you could really see those friendships bloom over time. So, just some food for thought there. So, the second one is, those who rarely cry may shed more believable crocodile tears. Crocodile tears are hard to spill. As such, most of us don't see them used as a manipulation tactic in everyday life, beyond those of us raising children perhaps. Even more so, almost all of us would probably be able to spot if we saw them. How we actually identify crocodile tears when we so rarely come across them has been a somewhat open question, relatively unexplored in scientific literature. A recent paper by Monica Robel and colleagues published recently in PLO1, however, has made efforts to fill in the gap. Through a series of experiments and reanalyses, they find hints that it's not just facial expressions that give the game away. Okay, so again, talking about the spirit of the article, crocodile tears. So from what my understanding is that crocodile tears are basically fake tears. It's when you're trying to be emotional, but you're not emotional. You probably couldn't care less, and you're just crying because that's what expected of you, and you want to fit in. And it is a massive manipulation tactic in everyday life. But thankfully, it is very hard to do. Thankfully, not a lot of people do it, and which is a good thing because no one ever likes to see people cry. So if we could all just cry suddenly to manipulate others, that would be horrible, and that would really put my trust in humanity quite low, to be honest. But I have heard that there are some people who are really good at it, which is really quite concerning. And this is where we step into the more applied areas of psychology. Because if we've got this basic knowledge about, right, we know some people shed crocodile tears, how do we spot it so we don't fall with the manipulation and we don't pander to them because we think they're genuinely upset and we want to comfort them? So how do we do that? And this is where good research comes in, and this is when stuff like egg experiments, reanalyses, which through a series of experiments and reanalyses, that's actually quite a good methodology because you're backing up your findings, you're creating more data to support your findings and your conclusions with. So that's really good. And the fact that they're reanalyzing their data and possibly other studies is really powerful because, especially if some of this research was done pre-replication crisis, we know some of these statistical methods were not rigorous and they were not very robust. So by reanalyzing the data using modern statistical methods, that's really good and really useful. And we always need to be exploring stuff in scientific literature. Personally, this is something I never would have thought to research because I think there are other stuff that I personally would prefer to research. Crocodile tears isn't one of them. But again, I really like clinical psychology, so I would prefer to look into more mental health stuff. It's just something to think about. So the last one is, do we see religious beliefs as the default? Religious beliefs have decreased over the last few decades. In the UK, for example, 72% of people describe themselves as a Christian in 2001. In 2021, this has dropped to just 46%. Even with the rise in secularism, however, there may still be what popular philosopher Daniel Dennett described as a belief in belief, a feeling, even in non-believers, that religious beliefs on the whole are a good thing. Writing in PONA, a team led by Brunel University's Will Gravis looks more closely at the idea of belief in belief. Using two philosophical vignettes, they argue that even atheists in non-religious societies often have an intuitive preference for religious beliefs over atheism. They propose that this could be due to a cultural evolutionary lag from the time when religion was much more powerful. Okay, so for the sake of the podcast, I don't upset too many people because, to be honest, whenever you talk about religion, whether you're pro-religion, whether you're atheist, etc., you always annoy quite a lot of people. So I'm going to keep this quite general. So back in episode 61 of the podcast, I interviewed Jo Francis Penn about religion, psychology, and her work as a fiction author, and she studied the psychology of religion at Masters at Oxford University. So if you want to learn more about religion, then please definitely check out that interview on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts from. So that's a really good interview that I conducted. To be honest, I am thinking of getting back to interviews because there are some people I would love to talk to on the podcast. And I'm a lot better at interviewing, so it's just an idea that I'm playing around with. So all I'm going to say about this article is that the preference for religious beliefs, I don't think that it could be a cultural evolutionary lag from when religion was really powerful, because as we know, when a religion, or before we had science, before we understood stuff like weather, earthquakes, and natural disasters, and what actually caused them, well, religion was really powerful because it was the only explanation that we had. So it was really powerful, and you can still see that whether even though religion has been disproven at this point, it's still a somewhat powerful force because it still impacts our laws, our social norms. For example, in the House of Lords in the UK, there has to be 26 bishops, so these religious figures have a direct impact on UK law. So religion still impacts us in a lot of different ways. And this is something that we've got to study in psychology, just so we understand how does religion, how does a person's beliefs impact their behaviour, how it benefits society, how could it potentially harm a society, how could it harm my minority groups, and how could it protect or harm people's mental health. It's just something to think about. So I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So moving on to the personal update. This week I've been doing lots of really fun projects, and on Thursday night I spent 3 hours helping the missing housemaid as I turn them in like today's podcast episode with their statistics and their coursework. Now, I still am adamant. I hate our studio. I hate our studio more than ever because I was really struggling. In fact, both of us were, because they were like, right, I need your help with my second year coursework. I looked over and I was like, yeah, this seems really straightforward, really easy. But for starters, the data set was really weird because the dataset included a lot of words. Words that, for example, one of the variables was, have you been a victim of a crime? And normally we would do that as a dichotomous one. So we would say 0, yes, 1, no, or vice versa. But this article, this data set, did it as words that were so like, yes, no, or they have been a victim of a crime. They haven't been a victim of a crime. Now, personally, what I probably should have done is I probably should have explained to my housemate, oh, we're just going to have to code these in our studio and tell them that this variable actually equals 1, this variable equals 2. But considering how lost they were and how stressed they were, and to be honest, I did not want to make this any more complicated than I had to, I said, no, we're not going to do that. But it was just such a weird data set, because if it was all dichotomous, or if it was done what I'm calling properly, for example, all numbers with the values meaning different things, that would have made so much more sense, and that would have been so much easier, but it wasn't. So all told, we spent about 3 hours doing this coursework, which they were quite impressed with, because they thought it was going to take us 8. I think if I had been doing this on SPSS, which is a beautiful one-click bit of software, and I'm sure I've made half the audience cringe by saying I prefer SPSS, I probably could have done it in an hour, and together we could have done that. But I was really struggling with the code because our studio is just a pain. It's the bane of my life. It's why I use it so rarely, except when I absolutely have to. And like, it took us 20 minutes just to upload the data and actually tell our studio, right, read this data file. This is the data that I want you to read, and I want you to understand this data. It's a nightmare. Absolutely hate our studio. But on more positive notes, Apple, besides from that, stuff is really good. I'm making like a lot of progress, a lot of different psychology bits I like going on, lots of different fiction projects, lots of business projects. Because next week I'm on a year 10 summer school, so I'm looking after a like corridor. I'm doing lots of different fun activities with 14 and 15-year-old students. They're going to come up to the university for like 3 days and experience a bit about university life. So it's going to be a great fun. I really am looking forward to it because it's just amazing. I absolutely love it. And I've also got a job in to do on a Tuesday during one of my breaks at the residential. So that should be a lot of fun. I'm doing some in to do prep, and I'm just learning a whole bunch of like different things about service evaluations for clinical services, which is an area I'm not that familiar with. but I'm learning a lot because I'm researching it and I'm really confident in it. So I'm looking forward to that. So lots of really good things are going on at the moment. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show note at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And please send pictures of where you're listening in from. It's always fun to see where all of you are from, all over the world. And you can also comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. And today's episode has been sponsored by Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology. So this is a brilliant sponsor for today's episode because lots of the social psychology looks at conflict, for example, relationship conflict between inner groups, out groups, and today's podcast episode focuses on passive aggression and how it hurts the target. So this book also allows you to explore concepts like social comparison, self-esteem, and other more social-based aspects of our mental health and what makes us feel good. But this book also looks at brilliant topics like acculturation, just so you can understand how our culture impacts our behaviour, but the psychology of persuasion. That's always a really fun and really a popular one. And so many more brilliant facets like the Milgram study, compliance over obedience. And I love this book. It's a lot of fun and lots of people recommend it. So that is Social Psychology, a guide to social and cultural psychology, available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, local bookstore or local library if you request it. And you can get the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive, Biblioteca, and Baker & Taylor. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you are wanting to continue. So if you want to become a patron of the show and support the podcast on a monthly basis, whilst getting access to tons of great rewards, including over 70 exclusive blog posts, which I've actually added some more to this week, that when we made into podcast episodes for weeks, months, or even years, then please head on over to patreon.com/the psychology of our podcast. If you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content parts of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what is passive aggression. And this is a great episode, so let's dive into it. So passive aggression is when someone doesn't get visibly angry, but they express their hostilities in passive aggressive ways designed to confuse and hurt their target. For example, blanking a person, not wanting to engage in conversation, and just ignoring the target of all examples of passive aggression. Other examples of passive aggression include avoiding responsibility for tasks, missing deadlines, withholding critical information, frequently underachieving in a contrast to what they're actually capable of, and sabotaging group projects, amongst others. For example, a few days ago, and what birthed the idea of this podcast episode, was that one of my housemates was away for a few months, but they had gone home, and the other two housemates, without permission, had turned the missing housemate's bedroom into a library. They put about 60 books in the housemate's room without permission, and I was texting the housemate, and they asked the other housemates to remove the books from their room. A week later, the books were still there even though the housemate said they had moved the books. So the missing housemate asked me to remove the books. I did. I put the books into the bedroom of the person who they belonged to, and they aren't using their room because they're sleeping with another housemate. That's a whole different story. Yet one of my housemates was furious that I had moved the books, so they barely spoke to me on Sunday and they blanked me all day on Monday, regardless of the friendly conversation I tried to engage with them. That's passive aggression. Even now, the housemate hasn't spoken to me about how furious they were. Anyway, when it comes to dealing with a passive-aggressive person, getting angry or nagging them will only put them on the defensive. This makes them make up excuses and deny the responsibility, and so this isn't a good way to deal with a passive-aggressive person. Thankfully, later on in the episode, we'll learn some of the healthier ways to confront passive aggression and how to handle relationship conflict. On the whole, the reason why I'm talking about passive aggression on a psychology podcast, besides it being a human behaviour, is because we will all encounter passive aggression in our lives. As aspiring or qualified psychologists, it's important that we learn how to deal with passive aggression from our peers, our clients, and in the mental health services we work in. Since if we allow passive aggression to impact the therapeutic alliance and our working relationship, then this might lead to very negative outcomes for our clients and decreased therapeutic success. This is something we have to avoid at all costs. That's why this knowledge is critical. What causes passive aggression? Passive aggression comes from a deep-seated anger, frustration, and hostility that the person doesn't feel comfortable expressing directly to the target. This is why when you deal with a passive-aggressive behaviour, you should bear in mind that all their behaviour underlies a deep sadness as well as unhappiness. For instance, my housemate who still is, or was, really angry with me for moving the books they are putting the missing housemate's room without permission, yet they are uncomfortable confronting me about it. Partly, it is because I know they have avoidant attachments, they will avoid conflict at all costs. Another facet of it is that they probably know they were in the wrong to not remove the books, like they told the missing housemate they did. Why is passive aggression dangerous? Passive aggression is dangerous because it's very damaging in relationships. The target of the passive aggression typically feels powerless, frustrated, and unable to get the passive aggressive person to cooperate with their conflict management efforts. This could lead the target to enable the passive aggressive person's behavior and assume all the responsibility and taking on a parental role that they don't want. The most damaging aspect of passive aggression is that in the end, all the conflict, anger, and resentment will still come to a head and need to be resolved if the relationship is to continue. For example, when my housemate was being really passive aggressive, I felt powerless, uncomfortable, and just awkward. It was so awkward to be in my own home and feeling like I had to be confined to my bedroom so I didn't have to interact or run into the housemate, who was just blanking me and radiating anger at me. In addition, passive aggression can be really frustrating to the target, because it's hard to prove it's passive aggression, or if you're just making it up and overreacting, or whether this passive aggression is unintentional, so this can lead to more conflict, especially if people struggle to have an open and honest conversation about the problem at hand. Personally, when my housemate first started being passive aggressive to me by not responding when I came home from spending time with my family and offering them to share my caramel donuts with them, then they didn't really respond. I said again, and I got an angry okay. I felt really unsure if they were being passive aggressive or not, and this feeling only got worse. I felt a little gaslit by myself at times, because I didn't know if I was overreacting, underreacting, if I was in the wrong for moving the books out of the missing housemate's room, and so on. It was just frustrating to me that yet again my housemate's avoidant attachment was impacting me. I was being punished for helping the missing housemate get the books that didn't belong to them out of their room. It's the silent treatment passive-aggressive behaviour. Technically, it depends if the silent treatment is passive-aggressive behaviour, but generally I would say yes, due to the more extreme forms of the silent treatment, like being completely ignored and refusing to respond to the target's attempts to communicate. These are more direct ways to express anger, frustration, and hostility, so technically they don't count as passive aggression. Yet smaller versions of the silent treatment, like pretending not to hear a friend's comment or failing to acknowledge a friend in the hallway, they are signs of passive aggression. In addition, silence can be a very powerful and effective way to passive-aggressively shame and hurt a target, because the silent treatment can be a quiet form of verbal abuse, even more so when someone in a position of power, like a parent, uses silence to manipulate someone vulnerable, like a child, since being ignored by someone you like or love is deeply hurtful, and it can cause lasting harm against the target. As a result, you can deal with the silent treatment by using better communication, as this can help to change the person's passive-aggressive behaviour. Due to, once you've identified the toxic behaviour, you can take a step back, stop participating in the toxic behaviour yourself, and affirm the passive-aggressive person's inner anger. For example, instead of me trying to engage with my housemate, which I ended up doing because I realised if they were going to completely ignore me, there was just no point trying to communicate with them. By taking myself out of that situation, the passive-aggressive person could see that I was no longer being impacted by their behaviour, and it wasn't hurting me anymore, so whatever power they thought they had over me was gone. Afterwards, you can affirm their anger by validating it. Of course, the passive-aggressive person is likely to deny their anger at you, because the whole point of that passive aggression is so they don't need to confront their emotions. Anyway, to handle the silent treatment, you can complement the areas of competence, reinforce the behavioural changes you want to see, and don't be afraid to revisit the subject if needed. Personally, I'll be the first to admit that this is something that I need to get better at. Me and my housemates have tried to have calm, validating, and supportive conversations so many times, and I used to think we would make great progress. We would validate each other, we would compliment each other about what we liked about the others, and we would ask for certain areas to be improved. When me and the missing housemates started noticing the other two housemates were saying the right things, but they weren't changing or putting in the effort, in fact, they were getting worse, we had a few more meetings, but we just gave up trying. Some people will never change, and it's frustrating. Hopefully your experience will be different. How to deal with passive-aggressive people. As mentioned earlier in the episode, passive aggression comes from the underlying sadness, anger, and or insecurity, and sometimes the person might not even be aware of these emotions. Therefore, the passive-aggressive behaviour can be an expression of these emotions, or an attempt to gain control in a relationship. When it comes to dealing with a passive-aggressive people, you need to be mindful about how you respond. You might want to be passive-aggressive yourself, but expressing your anger and frustration like this will only encourage the passive-aggressive person to act that way. Nothing changes in the relationship. The behaviour inside the relationship only gets more toxic. As a result, it's useful to show the passive-aggressive person that you respect and value their perspective, and this might help address some of the underlying sense of insecurity. just make sure you never apologise for unfounded offences, or this means you're forsaking the passive aggressive person. For example, I would never, ever, ever apologise to my housemate for moving all the books out of the missing housemate's bedroom. My passive aggressive housemate put over 60 books in their bedroom without permission, turning it into a library. When the missing housemate asked to move it, I was simply putting the books where they belong. If the passive aggressive housemate wanted to have a conversation with their partner, who's another housemate, telling them to stop buying books because they have no space for them, then they should do that. I didn't mention this in the podcast episode, but I know that's not going to happen because, again, avoiding attachment. They shouldn't keep putting their rubbish in other people's bedrooms without permission. However, one of the best solutions, and this is not ideal, is for you to limit your time with the passive aggressive person, as well as if you do decide that confrontation is the best path forward. I wouldn't recommend it, but believe me, I know how tempting it is, and sometimes confrontation really does seem like the best path forward. It's best not to be accusatory to the passive aggressive person as you calmly explain how the behaviour makes you feel. Again, in my experience, because I know my passive aggressive housemate has avoidant attachment, that just adds another layer of complexity. As well as limiting your time in their presence is not ideal, especially if you live with them. It can make you feel awkward, stressed, and like you're being restricted in your own home. That is not fun. That really is not fun. Yes, I get more stressed and more frustrated being in their presence than being confined to my bedroom, so I guess it works in a way. How do you respond to passive aggressive behaviour? When you encounter passive aggressive behaviour, it's useful to manage your own emotions effectively, so remove yourself from the situation or practice some self-soothing techniques whilst you get your emotions in a check. Afterwards, you should try to address the passive aggressive person's concerns directly, set clear boundaries, and if you think it is needed, spend less time with a passive aggressive person. Otherwise, it's very likely that you will only get hurt, and I don't want that for you. What can you say to a passive aggressive person? When you talk to a passive aggressive person about their toxic behaviour, it's important that you never apologise if you've done nothing wrong. Hold them to account for their behaviour and try to put your needs first. Of course, the passive aggressive person is likely wanting you to blow up, start shouting or screaming, and even start being passive aggressive yourself. Don't fall into that trap. Instead, the best way to talk to a passive aggressive person is to be calm and directly address the issue at hand, being specific about what upsets you and what behavioural changes you would like to see. In my experience, putting your needs first is a brilliant way to improve your mental health, because after I stopped trying to be friends with a housemate that was only taking energy from me, instead of giving me back anything in return, I felt a lot better, even if the housemate thought I was horrible, abusive, and helping doesn't come naturally to me, which I still find quite funny that they actually said that to me. I couldn't believe they said that, and everyone who I've told has been shocked, because I'm always helping people without a second thought. For example, this isn't in the podcast episode, but last night when I came up stairs thinking about, maybe I should just do some reading, I saw this broomstick waving about on the top of the garage roof, which I can see from my window, and I was like, what is going on? And it turned out that the neighbours' kids had got their ball, had actually got their football like lodged up there, and they were really struggling to get it. So I went down the stairs. I grabbed a chair. I grabbed a broom out of the wardrobe, just walked out of my house and said, did you want me to try and get it? I probably looked really weird, but I just wanted to help them because those kids are really nice and just it's a lovely family. So why wouldn't I help them? Anyway, though, so going back to the blog post. So when you put your needs first, passive aggressive people and people who use you will react badly. But you are the most important person. So you need to do what's right for you. Conclusion. At the end of this episode, we've learned a lot about passive aggressive behaviour, from what it is, some examples of passive aggression, and how to deal with passive aggressive behaviour, and so much more. This is important information for all of us to be aware of, because whether it's a friend, a client, or a colleague at work, we will always encounter a passive aggressive person at some point in our lives. Yet, being able to handle a passive aggressive person, protect our own mental health, and manage the relationship conflict are all critical life skills that will help us thrive in the future. That's all I want for all of you wonderful listeners. I just want you all to thrive. And now you know how to thrive in a passive aggressive situation. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did because, as I probably mentioned in that podcast episode, being in a passive aggressive situation, especially with someone you live with, is not fun. It's not nice. And it makes you feel really uncomfortable and really awkward just being around them. That's what I wanted to do today's podcast episode, so I can learn more about it, but also so I can learn what to do and what not to do when dealing with it in the future. So it's just something to think about. And if you know someone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, then please check out Social Psychology. Go to Social and Cultural Psychology, available in all the usual places. And if you want to become a patron of the show and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Wiley. So, have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day and I'll see you next time.